Today we're going to talk about the best books that I read this summer, mostly because I love talking about my favorite books and I want an excuse to talk about them again. I have 4 books on this list that are quite different from each other. I have 1 science fiction, 2 nonfiction, and 1 fantasy that I will be talking about. I'm also going to be talking about them from the book I liked the least to the book I liked the most. And with that, let's get into the first book. A Closed and Common Orbit. For a long time I thought this book said A Close and Common Orbit. I don't know why I thought that was the title. So this is the last Wayfarers book that I read. I have read all of the other Wayfarers books, but I've not read any non-Wayfarer Becky Chambers books. And I really need to do something about that because I love all of her books. So this is my least favorite Wayfarers book, but I still loved it. It's Becky Chambers. It gives you exactly what you expect with a Becky Chambers book, which is cozy, sci-fi, slice of life, and characters looking for home and belonging and finding different answers to that. So in this book, we follow 2 characters. We follow an AI who is disguising itself as a human and trying to blend in with the humans on a planet in a world that's not super receptive of AIs acting like humans or pretending to be humans. And we also have a human character who's kind of helping the AI out because the human character was raised by AIs. And we get to see her story from like when she was young, so we follow 2 timelines. So we follow the human character and the AI in the current time, and then we also go back in time to learn of the human character's past and how the human character ended up where she is now. Both of them kind of feel like outsiders, and they are looking for home and belonging and, you know, the people, the found family feeling, someone that they can call like their family. And they find that answer in different ways. And I feel like all of Becky Chambers' books really have those themes, and the characters often come to different conclusions. And I love getting to walk alongside the characters as they are making these discoveries for themselves. Next book is A Few Rules for Predicting the Future. I don't know if this book counts as a book. It's a very cool book. It's very shiny. This is an essay Octavia E. Butler wrote in 2000, and it says that she wrote it for the Essence magazine. It was a science fiction magazine she was writing an essay for, and then it has now been published in book form. It has very few words per page, and then for each section of the essay, it also has some art for that section of the essay. I think it's a very powerful essay. I have only read 1 Octavia E. Butler book, and I didn't get along with it as much as some people seem to, but I am very curious in reading more because I think Octavia E. Butler has some great ideas that I'm curious about. In this essay, Octavia Butler is confronted by someone at a book signing, and that person says like, oh, do you really think all of these things that you write about in your dystopian fiction is going to happen? And, you know, is the world really just doom and gloom? And she basically writes about why she writes dystopian fiction and how she sees it as an act of hope. So some of her inspiration for writing what she writes is she takes the problems that she's seeing in the world that are not being addressed and then just magnifies them to catastrophic levels. And so if we do not address these problems and they're allowed to just go unchecked for decades, what will happen? And that's what she writes about in her fiction. So she does think that they are things that could potentially happen in our world, but she also talks about how she sees writing these stories as a hopeful endeavor because she's giving a warning and saying, hey, we don't want to end up here, let's do something about this. And she also acknowledges that there's not one easy answer to, there's no magic bullet that's going to solve all of the problems, but there's thousands of answers and you could be one of them if you choose to. She also talks about some of her inspiration for her books and looking at history, and again saying if we don't understand history, if we don't understand how people ended up where they were, then we might end up repeating some of their same mistakes. And she talks about times in history when things are very polarized, and we all kind of have like in-group and out-group biases, but whenever we start pointing at the out-group and start blaming the out-group for all of the problems in society, for the destruction of our culture or whatever, then we start viewing them less as our neighbors and fellow humans and more as some alien other that we need to get and destroy. And that's very dangerous whenever we're talking about fellow humans. And I kind of see this in society today. This is something that annoys me the most, is just like the polarization and how much people have their group and they're like, we like these people and we don't like those people over there. Those people are causing all the problems. And I think that's a very negative way to interact with the world and with fellow humans. And everyone does it to some extent because everyone has their in-group that they identify with and their out-group that they don't identify with. But I think we should confront those biases whenever possible and work on ourselves in trying to understand the other that we don't understand currently. So I really liked this essay that Octavia Butler wrote. I think she has some very interesting ideas, and I'm excited to read more of her books. Next, I'm going to talk about 10 Days in a Madhouse. This is one of my most recent reads, and it is a fabulous book. So this is also a nonfiction. This is a journalist living in the late 1800s who went undercover as someone in an insane asylum. She purposely got herself committed to the insane asylum so that way she could report on the conditions there. And this book, I mean, it's terrible to read about the things that happen to these people, some of the people that are committed that obviously don't need to be in an asylum. And then just the conditions of the asylum there, how these women are treated, how they're even looked at by doctors and not believed and very much dismissed, how they're told to like sit still and not talk for hours on end, and how they're punished whenever they speak out or complain about things, just the horrific conditions. But this is also another book that's a little bit hopeful because the person, Nellie Bly, who is investigating this, she gets out of the asylum. She has her employer get her out of the asylum and then writes for the paper about what is going on, about the conditions in the asylum. And because she did this, she was able to shed light on what it's actually like, and she was able to be a catalyst for changing the conditions in the asylum. And that is hopeful. That is inspirational. She did something to uncover the injustices in her world that she was facing, that not her specifically was facing, but people were facing in her world. And she talked about it and exposed it, and then was able to change things because of that. And you can tell that she is a writer because it is very captivating. It reads a little bit like a thriller, and it is very inspirational, and I highly recommend it. And the last book on my list is A Sorceress Comes to Call. This is kind of like a cozy horror book. It follows two characters. So we have Cordelia, which is a girl who is living with her sorceress mother, and her sorceress mother can just take over her body and control what she does and what she says, and can sometimes, if she's mad at Cordelia, prevent her from moving at all for hours. And Cordelia is very isolated from the world, and something happens where the mom decides to flee town, and they end up at the mansion of this rich bachelor, which is where we meet our second perspective, which is Hester. She is the older spinster sister of the rich bachelor, and she is sensing that something's not quite right here. She does not like Cordelia's mother, and to some extent she extends that like well, she doesn't want Cordelia or her mother there, but she starts to sense that there's something wrong in their relationship, and Cordelia might be just as trapped as her brother is under the spell of the sorceress. And she does not know what's going on, but she is our outside perspective who is understanding the social norms of everything going on, whereas Cordelia is our inside perspective. She knows what the mother is up to and some of the shenanigans the sorceress is doing, but she is not very well adept at socializing because she's literally lived in isolation. This book is about overcoming abuse, parental abuse, forced isolation, and how to get out of these abusive situations. It is a dark, sinister story while also feeling cozy. There's a middle part of the book that kind of reminds me of Pride and Prejudice, particularly with like the mom trying to court the bachelor and some of the interactions that go on. It kind of reminds you of like a historical romance novel, but it's also like dark and sinister, and there's terrible things going on, and there are genuinely terrifying scenes where these undead animals try to trample you. It is quite the quirky, interesting book, and it just spoke to me on a personal level. This book also has a thread of hope throughout it because we are hopeful that Cordelia will speak up and get help, and we're hopeful that Hester might see what's going on and recognize it and also get help for Cordelia. I loved it. It's my new all-time favorite T. Kingfisher book, and I've read 3 T. Kingfisher books at this point, and I'm excited to continue reading more of them. And that concludes my favorite books of summer. Let me know what your favorite books are that you have read this summer, and if you have read any of these books, what your thoughts are, and I hope to see you in another video. Happy reading!